Great. Good morning, everyone. And is that on yet? Okay, good. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining me this morning. One of the great things about this conference is there's a lot of people talking about code, about tools, about things they've done, experiments they've run, research they've done. I'm not going to be talking about any of those things. I'm going to talk a little bit about some issues that I perceive in the community and things that I hope we can foster some conversation around and perhaps do something about regarding privacy, research data, and our community. First, a little bit about our organization. As mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization. We're a membership-based organization. We're based up in Baltimore. We develop things for the publishing, library, and software communities, things you might be familiar with, the ISBN number on the back of books, ISSN numbers, Dublin Core metadata. We also do things like education. And I just highlight this. We just published, just yesterday, a research data primer for early career professionals. I'm sure most of you in this room won't be needing it, but maybe people on your staff new to the community who are interested in these sort of issues. And we have our author here. Hi, Carly. Thank you. So very quickly, just a little bit of context. In 2010, this nice gentleman, who I'm sure you all are aware of, said something along the lines of, if he were creating Facebook in 2010, he would have set all of the privacy policies to be open as default. And a lot of people took this to say that the age of privacy is over. That's not exactly what he said. But I think the notion of privacy norms have sort of changed, and Facebook is kind of pushing us in that direction. But really, have they? I mean, people really do care about privacy. And this is just one example of a research study. This was published earlier this year from the Pew, stating that about 93% of people are really interested in privacy. Some 87% don't want to be tracked online, want to have some control of their privacy. And yet, we have things like Fitbits and iPhone tracking, and I use Map My Run, tracking my run this morning. So we're all generating a tremendous amount of data that is exceptionally useful in the community. And a lot of what we've been talking about here at this meeting has been associated with that. So we're in a bit of a conundrum. I think the fact that 2014 was sort of defined as the year of the breach, I mean, how many of us had to find a new credit card because our data was stolen by Target or released from Target or a variety of other providers? I don't want to go too far afield here, but there is an association between privacy and security. But not all issues of privacy are hacks. Not all breaches are necessarily malicious. And not all data sharing is inappropriate. And where do we find that fine line between what is appropriate, what is useful, and what we can do with the data we're generating? Many of us use Google Analytics for our websites. I mean, this is one example of how we are leaching information about the behavior of people who use our systems to the community in ways that we don't necessarily know or really understand what's going on behind the scenes. Another privacy-related issue came up just last year in the library community, where Adobe, which is using something called Adobe Digital Editions, which is a digital rights management software, was transmitting information back to Adobe's digital central servers. It was doing so in an unencrypted manner so that anyone could sniff out exactly what was in someone's, say, library on their computer. I don't think this was necessarily malicious on Adobe's part. I think it just goes to show how privacy isn't necessarily at the top of minds of organizations that are creating the software that we're using in our day-to-day lives. So kind of switching back gears a little, as I mentioned, we work primarily with the library and publishing communities. We often envision the library as looking something like this. But in fact, many libraries these days look more like this. The IT infrastructure for the library is often one of the most intensive areas in an academic institution to create and share information. And a lot of library information is now provided not by the library, it's provided in the cloud via service providers. The content that you go when you access something online isn't actually in the library, it's hosted by the publisher's site. The discovery services are hosted by third parties. So increasingly, what the library community is providing to the community, to the patrons, is actually not managed by the library. And this runs into something, one of the core principles of the library community. The library community, since the 1930s, has had this as part of their code of ethics about the commitment that the library community has to intellectual freedom and the right of privacy for people who are accessing library services. And this was a response to World War I, where people were actually jailed for their library search behaviors. And ever since then, the library community has actually been very strong proponents of intellectual freedom in a way that most of the rest of the community doesn't really recognize. But they've been staunch advocates for privacy. And how this relates to our community, this conversation, data repositories are generally not libraries. Not all data scientists are librarians. They don't have this background and kind of grounding in intellectual freedom. One approach to privacy is, I'm going to use as an example, the Internet Archive. I don't know how many top 10, I think top 20 websites on the web erase their server logs so that they protect the user privacy. I think they stand out in this regard. But I think that's sort of an absolutist approach, and I don't think it's going to be really useful. I mean, if we're here talking about data science, what information we can glean from data, erasing the data every night is not a good idea. So where is there a happy medium in there related to what we can do with research data, but also simultaneously address some of the privacy concerns? Because ideally, we want people to continue to contribute data in a way that we can continue to use it. So I like to think of things, and this is maybe as scientific as I'm going to get in this presentation, kind of vectors that are related to privacy that are specific to research data, and some of the issues around this that I perceive that are challenging for our community. The first is data sets that actually contain personally identifiable information. Much of what we're talking about here is either medical data, sociological data, economic data, business information. Much of that data around that involves human subjects. So much of even data that is notionally devoid of personally identifiable information can point to personally identifiable information. Latinia Sweeney in 2000 showed that 87% of Americans can be identified by 3 data points: zip code, sex, and come on, scroll, birthday. 3 data points. Yesterday in his talk, Peter Satora yesterday made a point about cookies and how in his community they've identified something like 3 million potential data points from cookies, and how they can identify whether or not it's my 8-year-old son who's browsing the web rather than me. And while it might not contain personally identifiable information, if they can calculate that it's my 8-year-old son browsing the web and not me, they can pretty much guarantee that they could use that processing power to identify me personally, using, I don't know, my operating system, my battery, and the IP address where I'm gaining my, my access. So we have to think broadly about personally identifiable information, what counts as personally identifiable information that is included in that data. There are issues with an anonymization. You can strip away all of the personally identifiable information out of a data set, but then how valuable is that data set? Where's this fine line here between removing all of the useful information from a set of data and still having a useful set of data? I'm not going to get into any of the technical issues. There are many, and we're going to be talking, and the next speaker in the next session, the next plenary session, is going to be talking about anonymization in more detail and more technical detail. But really, what's the balance there? Another issue and vector here that I think is important is we want to share data and we want to merge data so that we can draw novel conclusions from that merged data sets. You might strip out personally identifiable information from one data set, and you might have another data set that doesn't have personally identifiable information. But when you combine them, you might expose personally identifiable information. By combining multiple data sets and pulling together different data stores, you could triangulate to personally identifiable information. Another vector that I think is important is, say you have a data set that is historical in nature, and you presume that everyone in it is dead. A great example of this is there's a mental health facility that was closed in the 1920s. And some researchers want to do some data mining on that data store. And you presume that everyone who was there from the 1920s is no longer with us. But say if you combine that mental health data with something like Ancestry.com data, some genealogical data store, you could then historically track back to people who are alive today and say there is potentially some genealogical or genetic link to mental health disorders. Well, your great-great-great-grandfather was here in this mental health facility. Congratulations. You have a 50% chance of getting Alzheimer's, so we're not going to insure you anymore. I mean, these are the sort of issues when you're combining multiple data stores and dealing with personally sensitive information. Another issue, and something that I don't think is discussed much, at least in this context, is the issue of the data that's being generated by the use of these systems. Internet systems are all tracking behavior all the time. We've got log files about who's using those systems. If you know enough about a field and you are looking at who is gathering information and using, say, heart medical data from multiple different sources, and you can see the IP range and say, well, that person is coming from Harvard Medical School. I bet that's probably Professor so-and-so. And if they're looking at this and this and this, if you know enough about the field, you could maybe discern what their research is, maybe jump ahead of them, maybe patent their technology before they do. Who is keeping track of these logs? Who is making them available? Who is using that data? I am aware of a couple organizations who are taking public data stores, replicating them on their own internal servers, which is perfectly fine. I mean, they're open data, so it's perfectly fine. There's not a problem with that. But the reason that they're doing that is so that no one is tracking their behavior. If you think about how many of these data stores are run by government institutions, are the usage logs subject to FOIA requests? They may be. So what are policies and practices regarding the tracking of researcher behavior in these systems? And what are the policies that those providers have to manage that flow of information? Another issue I think is relevant here is the replication and the interaction with other systems that is taking place when accessing data. Again, this is sort of the Adobe Digital Editions issue. Are you sharing these data over secure protocols? Even if it does contain personally identifiable information, how secure is that transmission process? Another important vector that I don't think we spend enough time on is the metadata that's associated with these data sets. What sort of information are we storing and sharing related to provenance, minimum viable consent? What was the policy or the legal constraints of the community where this data was created? Stephen mentioned this in his keynote yesterday. I think there's many issues here about the international legal aspects of data sharing, and how do we describe those? And the many different legal frameworks, HIPAA and FERPA and EC privacy laws, etc. This is a very complex ecosystem in which we're operating, and the legal environment is incredibly complex and often contradictory. I think we are all operating in this context, and how do we navigate some of this? So those are some of the issues that we are considering, and what do we do about these? To be honest, I'm not exactly sure, and that's why I'm talking to you all. But I think the indisputable fact is that data analysis, data gathering, data sharing can be an extremely useful and powerful tool to produce novel discoveries. And we don't want to be in a situation where we are limited either by legislation, limited by patron involvement and engagement in these systems. So how do we support discoveries? How do we support this infrastructure in a way that addresses some of these privacy concerns? One approach that NISO is undertaking presently, related specifically to publisher library systems and software providers in our community are looking at, is an initiative to develop some principles around patron privacy in these systems. I want to shout out to the Mellon Foundation for generously funding this work. It was a modest amount of funding, but I really appreciate their support of these issues. And we've undertaken about a 6-month project, which culminated with an in-person event in San Francisco back at the end of June. This is the Mason Center where we met and spent 2 days discussing this. The goal of this project is to establish a framework of principles that describe how information systems should respect the privacy of patron data. And we are working on a set of draft principles that cover this set of different topics. Talking about transparency, what sort of policies and descriptions and statements should be made by organizations about their perspective on privacy, issues around security, issues around data collection and how it should be used, the responsibilities of the actors in the community to do awareness. It doesn't help anyone if you have a privacy policy that is buried on your website. So how proactive do you need to be to describe to users? I mean, we don't want to go quite so far as to say the EU approach, where just about every time I hit a page, it's like, oh, privacy, 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 which just teaches people to ignore it. But other issues around informed consent. What does it mean to consent? How should data be shared? In what way should it be shared? What sort of anonymization issues are dealt with? Notification. Issues around anonymous use. So can I use a system without displaying to the community that I am Todd Carpenter and I've logged in at a particular time? As well as accountability, is anyone actually following their procedures? I mean, Google has a privacy policy. Has anyone ever audited it? Do we know that Google is conformant with its own policy practices? So my issue is, can we do something here similar within the research data community? I think we can. I think we can engage the researcher community, the researchers, administrators, the folks who run repositories, the folks who run tools, create analytical suites of services, data publishers, funding organizations, as well as privacy advocates. I think there is an opportunity here for us to engage in a conversation to define a consensus set of principles that are specific to research data and its use. And I think this is going to be really important because we do want to foster the continued development of this research. We do want to foster the development of these tools. And that all goes back to the willingness of the human subjects who are creating this data to actually allow its creation, allow its sharing. And also, I like to think that we might be in a position to avoid some of the kind of more stringent legal constraints on our industry, which might result if we aren't proactive in protecting protecting the privacy of the subjects of the data we're collecting. So I'm happy to take any questions. Included here in the slide deck, which I'll post to SlideShare, I don't know if Wolfram also distributes it, are a few links to some of the NISO project on privacy and some other resources. So happy to take any questions. Thank you.